do is to walk through some of toward the last 2/3 of the book, and then I'm going to actually do a departure and speak a little bit about what's going on in Syria right now, because it really does connect with what Bernard Henri Levy is writing about, and it's obviously in a lot of people's minds, not just Syria, but Iran itself, and it really dovetails perfectly with what he's talking about. On those of you who have the book, I'm looking on page 84 right now. He gives examples of anti-Semitism post-October 7th. And while we all know them far too well, I think it's important to reiterate, because so many people think that we're exaggerating. In my position here as a head of school and other places in the community, I've come up against people who've said very nicely and some not so nicely, no bemet, well, they didn't do it in Hebrew, no bemet, lo lagzim, you would say in Hebrew, don't exaggerate. Come on already, it's enough. It's not that bad. But when you take a look at Jewish history, not even thousands of years, but literally in the last year, you get this kind of a iteration. A Cornell professor in a video with 12 million views, declared that October 7th massacre had, quote unquote, exhilarated him because it shifted the balance of power. Also at Cornell, a student was charged with threatening to bring an assault rifle to campus and shoot all you pig Jews, to stab and slit the throat of Jewish men, to rape and throw off a cliff Jewish women, and to behead Jewish babies in imitation of Hamas. Another individual suggested that the participants in the Nova Music Festival deserved what happened to them because they were partying on stolen ground. At Cooper Union, a relative of ours went there for her bachelor's in New York. Terrified Jewish students were locked in the library for their own protection as a mob tried to bang down the doors. At Pomona College, pretty close to here in California, a shrine was erected to honor the quote-unquote insurgents. At Rutgers in New Jersey, an undergraduate was arrested for making death threats against Israeli students. At Columbia and Barnard on October 8th, just the day after the massacre, Professor Joseph Massad celebrated the attacks as, quote-unquote, awesome. On October 28th, 144 faculty members signed a letter referring to the massacre of unarmed civilians as a military action and justified it as an occupied people's right to exist. I can go on and on and on and on. There's one left. 6 months later, the campus was transformed, Columbia, into a hotbed of violence and hate at the Gaza Solidarity Encampment, with chants of "We are Hamas," calls to become martyrs, and young people screaming that October 7th should be done 10,000 times over. On the eve of Passover, a rabbi called for Jewish students to go home as their safety could no longer be guaranteed. He calls it a cesspool of shame, but the icing on the cake, and most of us still remember this, the spectacle to end all spectacles was the moment when the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn appeared before the House Committee on Education and Workforce and clumsily skirted the issue, right? So this was when they testified before the House Committee on Education, and famously or infamously, the president said of Harvard, it depends on context. When they were all three women, when she was asked by the committee members, is it anti-Semitism calling for the river to the sea, let Palestine be free? And she said, it depends on context. They were hit by the press, by people in Congress, by Democrats and Republicans, primarily Republicans, for being so legalistic as to lose the forest for the trees. The reason why I go into that, and he puts in so many more examples, is that those of us who have contact with the non-Jewish world, other faith communities, we're often, like I said, recipient of, come on already. Yes, it was bad, but don't exaggerate. Um, and some of us, I think, almost hold back because it almost sounds ridiculous to us to say again and again. It's almost quote unquote overkill. I think for good or for ill, there's value in not holding back, in making sure that people hear this. None of us are saying it's every single university. None of us are saying it's every single faculty member or administrator. But we are saying that if DAFCA, this was about any other faith community, any other ethnic community, about the African American community, the Latino community, the Asian community, about women, about those who are physically disabled, about anyone else, there would be a cry from here to Jennensveld about how terrible this is, and yet it's open season to be able to say that about and among Jews. So he goes into some other history I think is really important, but I just wanted to pause. Do you feel yourself now over a year after 420 odd days since October, I think almost 430 days since October 7th? Um, do you have conversations with other people from other communities? Do they shrug it off? Do they deny it? Do they minimalize it? I'm really curious what people are hearing.
I think some of the Jews um, are not comfortable with the whole thing. In other words, they want it to be over, and they're beginning to sympathize more with Gaza. You know, there was an incident today in the papers about the Jewish interim president, is it of Cornell? Something with a course on Gaza that he doesn't want to allow.
And I'm sorry, what did he say?
He, I think, forbade a course on Gaza, and they were all upset about it, of course.
So
Well,
I
yeah,
just wanted to add that for the most part, and I think this is true with Debbie too, but she can chime in if different. Maybe we've been blessed to not have too much of this directly. And the conversations I do have with some of my non-Jewish friends have generally actually been somewhat supportive and not anti-Semitic, if you will. On the other hand, we recently came back from a synagogue-sponsored civil rights journey in the South, where we
mhm,
started in Atlanta at Dr. King's church, which is now Raphael Warnick's church.
right.
And he had a guest pastor give a sermon, and he starts talking about Hagar. And some of us looked at each other and said, "Oh, he's talking about our parsha. Isn't that interesting?" Because it happened to be that parsha that we had just read. But his take on it was completely different. How do you get yours if you expel Hagar? And how do you treat Hagar is what's important. And the Jews, there were three different synagogue groups there. All of the visiting groups that uh, Senator Warnock announced were all Jewish and all synagogue groups. And we were one of them. And we got very quiet. I mean, he welcomed us. That's when he announced us. He was welcoming us. But we all got very quiet while the congregation was cheering. And if you've ever been to a ecstatic African American service, you'll know what I mean.
Right.
But they were cheering and, shouting yes and applauding. And we were all thinking, what is this actually about? And I talked to uh, Rabbi Jacobs about it later because I thought, well, maybe it's just a different take on the story of Hagar. And maybe we need to talk to each other so we have some understanding. And maybe there's even a midrash that since Hagar was an Egyptian and she finds an Egyptian wife for Ishmael, maybe there's even a midrash that connects that to later Egyptian slavery of the Jews. I don't know. But what Rabbi Jacob said is that's interesting, but don't you think what he was actually saying is we, meaning the Black church, should support the Palestinians?
No, I don't think
Support the
that is what he
people
was
in
making.
Gaza?
I'd like to pick up on something that Sheila said, if I may.
I was gonna do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, go ahead. And then I think Bob wanted to say, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob.
That was not what he was. This was a sermon about kids. This whole, he was the executive director of the Children's Defense Fund. And so, and his main point was that, that God listened to the kids, that, that Hagar cried and that God listened to the kid in the still voice or whatever,
That's true. That's
basically,
correct.
and he was also making a big point that Hagar was the slave who got thrown out, so it was two different issues, but the it was a Black church talking about the issues of the Blacks. It was right after the election when Trump won the election and is going to move everything back in terms of all of the things that the Blacks had attained, in the last 20, 50 years or whatever, from rights. And so this is what he's feeling, is like the Blacks, that basically, the slaves are getting, thrown out, and that was the point he was making. And then that the God heard the kid. Those were the
Right.
points.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Bob. I'm only saying that our take on that story
is
is
different.
different
Yeah,
than his
that's correct.
take. And
Yes.
we weren't really understanding each other, if you will, because we weren't talking to each other at that point. And that there was at least some discussion afterwards. I didn't think of the idea that it isn't that long a leap to say that among the oppressed are the people of Gaza, and who's oppressing them? The same people who threw out Hagar and Ishmael.
So for me, the takeaway is the subtext is that we need to talk to each other a lot more and listen to each other and hear each other's narrative. I'm trying to do that out here, and if it was harder, if it was hard before October 7th, all the more so now, but all the more important to do just that. So I applaud you guys. It sounds like both of you were there at Reverend Warnock's, I almost said his shul, his church. I think it's hugely important.
It was a great trip, and there was a lot of really good conversation during the trip. But I guess I started my Jewish communal activity in community relations, so I couldn't agree with you more that we need to be talking with each other a lot more and not just at each other.
Yeah, yeah. So those incidents, like I said, Levy writes, catalogs many of them. He from that he says on 86, none of this is new, of course. So he cites the history that so many of us know. All of Israel's wars over the past half century have given rise to similar eruptions of madness. And those of us who've been involved, either as lay people, as professionals, it's interesting, Dafka, that, when something happens, so many people, either younger generations or those who weren't in the know, say, oh my goodness, look what's going on. And the others of us, I hope not in a jaded way or cynical way, are saying, guys, you don't remember X, you don't remember Y. We've seen this movie before, as we say in Hebrew. All of Israel's wars over the past half century have given rise to similar eruptions of madness. Moreover, the two are closely linked. In 82, in one of his books, I argued that blaming Jews has been a theme with many variations. First, in the Christian era for killing Christ, then in the anti-Christian Enlightenment for having given birth to him, then in the socialist era for making common cause with capitalism, and then with the advent of biology for constituting a definitively foreign race. After all that, I showed how in our own age, the words of hate most likely to reap the whirlwind are those that link the Jews to previously demonized Israel. I posited that it's not so much that an anti-Zionist is necessarily anti-Semitic, but that there is no other way for a present-day anti-Semite to express his hate effectively than through this channel of hatred for Israel. But this time around, the hate was immense. So what he's saying is what so many of us know, that one of the reasons why anti-Semitism is called the most ancient hatred, the oldest hatred, is that it morphs like a science fiction creature. In the day way before Jesus, thousands of years ago, it was seen as otherness, other than the pagans around us, other than Rome, other than Greek, other than the Babylonians, other than the Assyrians. Then, with the advent of Christianity, it was seen as we were had committed deicide, the killing of the Christ, or just not accepting Jesus. Then further on, it was we had given birth to a Messiah in the Age of Enlightenment, which was anti-religious. Then, of course, it was racial. Then, of course, it was nationalistic. In the midst of socialists, we were seen as capitalists. In the midst of capitalists, we were seen as socialists and communists. It was astounding how this thing called anti-Semitism changes and therefore becomes a new entity in every generation, in every decade, in every century. So if one blamed oneself for feeling the shock that the shock had produced and needed to be forgiven for the moment of distraction and vacillation during which the world communed for an instant with the attacked Israelis before being overtaken by a blunt, mad, and almost limitless hatred. So now they're baby-killing Jews. Jews who, in the name of time of Shylock or Pharaoh, cut their pound of flesh from the living body of the world. Jews guilty of murdering the modern Christ, that is, the Palestinians of Gaza. So he develops this theme with much more depth, that in the strangest way, the Palestinians have become the Christians and we've become the Romans. Everything is projected and turned on its head. So the victims are now the oppressors and the victimizers are now the oppressed. David has become Goliath. Goliath has become David. Those of us who involved in Middle East and Israel issues for quite a while, there was a narrative that frankly we leaned into, that Israel is surrounded by 22 Arab nations, by 1 billion Muslims in the world. This tiny little speck, it's the size of New Jersey, or on the West Coast, you used to say it's the size of San Bernardino County, tiny, tiny, tiny. And we showed the map, and here's the sea of, usually painted in red, Arab countries. So we did lean into that. And then it got turned on its head when we also leaned into high tech and what's it called, the book about Israel that how I'm blanking on the name, about 10 years or maybe 15 years
Startup
ago.
Nation.
Thank you. Startup Nation, the technological process, the high military progress that we made. We can, we stand apart. We've made the desert bloom. So we leaned into that we allowed some of our enemies, by propaganda, by Hasbara, to say, look at that. This is a classic case of the downtrodden against the oppressors. And we were connected to the West, who are, in their eyes, colonizers, settlers, oppressors, apartheid, even genocide. So the Palestinians of Gaza have now, frankly, become the Jews in a different era. And I think he's got a point there. Jews guilty through the one last twist of irrationality in the mad vision of the world, not of being a race, but of not being one. So now the next iteration is that they're not, a separate entity. They're part of the white oppressor, settler, colonialist, privileged. So not only are we not oppressed or not victim or we're not even a minority, we don't even have our own existence. We're just part of this white conglomeration of power and privilege. It was in a tidal wave of hate. Israel does, however, have friends, of course. And he says, President Biden, who calls himself a Zionist, affirmed Israel's right to self-defense, but he has problems with his own party. April 13th, I'm sure you're all aware, remember that there was this unprecedented barrage of missiles and drones, hundreds coming in from Iran into Israel, never done before. And a coalition, the United States, and with help from Jordan and even Egypt in an indirect way, was able to take them all out. So yes, we do have friends. But the question is, where will they still be there? And I want to develop this a little bit further when push comes to shove. The other friends are what he calls Christians of integrity, who understand the part of themselves that the Jewish people embody and how, without their existential obstinacy, their determination to remain rooted in their origin, which is also their destination, Christianity itself would be in danger. Israel also has friends in the Arab and Muslim world who have understood, like the Kurds, and Levy, if you've read any of his other books, he's a huge fan and supporter of the Kurds against the Turks, that this war is their war as well. Israel has, because Levy is obviously French, friends in his country, what he calls the old liberals, the old French, somewhat similar to the old liberals, the old Democrats, kind of like the Bidens of the world in this country as well. But what he then goes to is, can they be counted upon? Are they going to be able to stand up and step up when the call comes? So Christians of integrity, friends in the Arab and Muslim world, the old friends in Israel, of Israel, like in France, the new friends of Israel on the far right. And one of his questions is, not only can they be counted on, don't they have another agenda? The evangelical Christians also, are they only there to support Israel because of Judgment Day? So here I want to pause, and I'll hear what you have to say, and then I'll give you a little experience that our daughter in Jerusalem had about this. The evangelical Christians, the new friends on the right, they have their agenda. Some of them are supportive of Israel in and of itself, innately, but some on the far right, and also evangelicals, the Christian evangelicals, are supportive of Israel for their own long-term agenda. My question is, so what? Does that matter?
I was wondering, in terms of young people, especially young Jewish people that are in the universities today. And I don't know what percent, but I understand a small percent of the people that are protesting and in the sit-ins are young Jewish people. If that assumption on my part is true, then I wonder what the Jewish day schools do or could do to prepare their students once they leave the high school level in a Jewish day school and go to the university. As an example, I was reading the book by, her last name is Schwartz, where she makes the statement that when Hebron was massacred in 1929, that was the beginning of what we're experiencing now.
Mm-hmm.
Many of those young people that are leaving the Jewish day schools have that kind of knowledge from when the destruction of the temple until the state was reestablished in 1948. What the Jewish residents were experiencing under the different governments from that time, from the Arab to the Turks, that they weren't doing that well, that there was a lot of programs, especially the one in Hebron is the famous one, but there were things all through that time. How do we get youngsters who are leaving the day schools, the Jewish day schools, I'm not talking about the public schools, prepared with that knowledge so when they get to the university, they can respond intelligently? And maybe
Okay.
it's going on, I don't know if it is.
Yeah, no, clearly I have a lot that I've been thinking about for many years about that. Let me kick it out to everybody, what your response is, and then I'll share with what I'm thinking.
Well, we had a speaker the beginning of November, and she's pointed out that what we have to do in the day schools is to teach the kids. We're so busy teaching them the Bible in Hebrew, but we don't teach them about Jewish history and all that, and we don't teach them how to react to all this material. And so that has to be part of the curriculum.
So
And you know, it has to be part of the curriculum also in the synagogues. We have these groups like Hamakom on Monday night. I don't know what they do, but these kids need to be brainwashed so they can answer the question. We used to say this all the time because it was mainly anti-Semitism that we were trying to train our kids to answer questions about. But now it's questions about Israel.
So I agree with a large part of that, you know, as somebody who loves history, who studies history, who teaches history, it drives me crazy that this isn't nearly an ahistorical country at this time. Or
By the way,
ahistorical.
it's not just Jewish history.
No, of course.
We
of
don't know
course.
our own history.
Well, and if you look at the curricula in high schools around the country, you know, we bemoan the fact that money isn't going into the arts, and we all know that, and that really is a tragedy on many levels. It's not going into history either. The humanities is about literature, which is wonderful, of course, social studies, kind of broadly. But we're really doing ourselves a disservice. And this country, like I said, you know, we think history was a minute ago, and we think ancient history is 50 years ago. So we not just like we do languages, and this is not a knock against Americana. There are some wonderful things in our school system, in our society, obviously, barur. But we don't do a great job at learning nor teaching language, and we don't do a great job. I'm talking about in general, not just in the Jewish schools, about learning nor teaching history. So in that way, I agree with you, but I think there's another thing to say as well. Yossi?
Okay, again, Jerry, in line of what we just said, very interesting. Do you know that in Cleveland recently, it's in the Jewish news today, and I heard about it last week, young Jewish people, some of them from Cleveland Heights, talking about age group of college, they're demonstrating by a virtual place this Sunday or Saturday, Jews for Palestine. And they're calling Israel Nazis and all that. How do you explain that? That's again going back to that topic, lack of education.
So counterintuitively, I believe very firmly that not only we're not teaching Jewish and Zionist and Israel history, we're not teaching it completely or comprehensively. If Nomi, who is, you know, as Zionist as they come, she made Aliyah almost 10 years ago. She's studying law. She's going to intern in the Misrad HaChutz, the foreign ministry. She served. She was an officer. So she has Zionist bona fides. She will tell you that, and she hits me where I live. She said, Dad, you know, the curricula in the day schools leave it for Jewish students to find out on their own some of Israel's faults. So, instead of saying that Israel can do no wrong, I didn't think we were doing that, certainly not in Agnon and then Mandel, but she said many of her friends who went to Orthodox day schools, K through 12, were not taught some of the more uncomfortable aspects of Israel's history. I've always
I don't
thought,
think they were taught anything about Israel's history.
well, no,
It
no,
was it was
they
assumed that they would get it from their youth groups or hearsay.
well, but they were taught about Herzl and Rav Kook and Trumpeldor and very proud moments of 48 and 67 and 73. But I'm not saying to demean Israel or to wallow in the problems. But if we don't explain to our children the context, the framing of something like Deir Yassin, which did happen, if we don't talk about the 10 to 12 to 15% of Palestinians who were forced out, not all of them, but some were, then we're going to leave it till they get to high school or probably college, where the first time they hear something, they're going to wonder in their head, what else was I not told? So I think not only do we need to speak about lovingly Jewish history, Israeli history, Zionist history, we also have to, explain to people that Israel as a new state, there are reasons why we did certain things in certain ways, just like this country, just like France, just like the UK. They're not, no country is blameless. I think it's really important that we provide a comprehensive concept. I think that will help in a large measure, but we start with put it into the curriculum. It's just not there. Now, public schools, as my friend from New Jersey would have said, forget about it. They start from such a deficit that they don't know an aleph from a bet. Part of what I do now in my new position, I and Jewish students are going to public schools and talking about what it means to be part of the Jewish people and Israel and just basic empathetic narrative. What these guys don't know is frightening, mamash, insanely frightening. So some of it's beyond our pay grade. It's about making sure that the curricula are a lot more serious about history in general. So that's a piece of it. But like I said, even in our own day schools, we have to come to grips with make sure history is part of the curriculum and make sure that we're okay about some of the warts and all picture. It's an element of strength when we can say, this is where we messed up. It's not strength to say, oh, no, we did no wrong. It's dafka insecurity when we say that. When we're honest with our people in age-appropriate ways, at age-appropriate times, then they'll say, okay, it's like mom and dad. They're not perfect, but I love them because of what they've done for me. I understand growing up was hard. So the same thing. They have to understand Israel in its complexity. Yossi, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I want to say, Jerry, you kids were born in the US, am I right?
Yes.
You are an American. I don't know the background. Your wife is Israeli, but no, what I'm saying is, you kid, and look at your daughter. She's very Israeli. Went to the army,
Yeah.
and she's so involved. So it comes from home. It comes from education, and I see
Yeah.
that. I see many friends here that the kids were born here. They're not even Israelis, the parents, but it comes from home. They discuss it. They discuss Israel at home, how important it is, beside the school, but at home too. And then the kids grow up to be Zionists, and then they join the Israeli army, and they become so, you know, so it's all involved, and that's what testimony to you and your wife. I mean, you kid or your daughter became so involved with Israel.
So
That's
look, first, thank you.
I'm very
And we're all, we're in our own echo chamber, right? Everyone on here is already connected to a synagogue. That already makes you, a small minority within a minority. You're on a Zoom about this crazy book. You're a minority and a minority and a minority. I know, I get that. Sometimes I think we really do only speak to ourselves. We somehow have to. We've started a program here called the Ambassadors, right? It's not patented, so you can use the name. Everybody can. We need to speak to our coworkers, our neighbors, our relatives, The ones who are not, as we say in Hebrew, Mishugad Devar, crazy about the thing. The ones who don't necessarily go to shul all the time. The ones who don't have Jewish books on their bookshelf, but who might, because of their relationship, personal relationship with us, say, okay, I'll go to one meeting. I'll see a movie. I'll read a book. And little by little, we have to expand it, because if we just keep it to those who, are steeped in this history, then it's going to diminish, and will only be around for those who are, like I said, Mishugad Devar, crazy about this thing. We somehow have to expand the pie, not just be happy with, I'm thrilled to death. Debbie too, she can't make it. She's speaking with a client now on Zoom. I love this, that we're talking to each other. I wish we were talking to hundreds more. I think that's what we need to do. So Yossi, you're right. It starts in the home, not just in school, not just in day school. Don't tell them I said that. Youth groups, summer camps, the books on our shelf, the movies we see, an Israel trip. We have to make sure, even now, Dafka now more than ever, that we expand that pie. That's huge. So I think Yossi, you're right. These things about that Levi says that Israel does have allies. Like I said, Christians with integrity, old friends in Israel, the evangelical Christians. I asked you the question, I want to push it a little bit. Should it matter that our supporters in the evangelical Christian community have their own issue and their own agenda? They support Israel because it's part of their idea of Judgment Day, which will allow Jesus to return. Does it matter, or should we just accept their support? Sonia?
Well, everybody has their own agenda, regardless. And we're going to win some and we're going to lose some. But it's important, as you said, to discuss these things as often as we can with people who don't know the whole story.
And what about those who are elected officials in politics who are supportive of Israel, but they're also problematic in other areas? Do we accept their support and kind of hold our nose? Do we say, man, that's great. Thank you so much for that vote, even though I don't like your vote on 10 other issues? How do we deal with that?
I don't know how. If I did, I'd be a genius.
Sheila?
Jerry,
I
if
think
I
we
were,
have to take what we get.
yeah,
And
I think
this way
that's
we have
right.
an in. Then we have an in with these people.
Also,
So
if
that-
I'm wearing my APAC hat, which I wear maybe a little less often than I used to, for better or worse, but they would say that having support from as many people as possible on both sides of the aisle is critical to getting past what Israel needs passed to help support it, military aid, etc. Getting back to your original question, I don't know. I mean, I think that maybe the Judgment Day that they're looking for with a second coming is far enough in the future that none of us have to worry about it. I mean, we don't think it's happening at all, but we don't have to discuss that, right? We both think the Mashiach is coming. The difference is they think he's coming again, and we were still waiting for the first time. But in terms of day to day, I think maybe the critical thing to remember, and I think maybe Levi gets at this a little bit, is or maybe gets at it a lot, and I just didn't internalize it enough. But this idea that it's when, for example, some of the Arabs start to try to destroy archaeological sites to try to eliminate the idea that the Jews are the actual indigenous people. It's a problem for the Christians because the Christians aren't coming from nowhere. They're coming from us. So if our story isn't true, their story isn't true.
That's a great point. Yes, go ahead.
there's two concerns that I have with the fundamentalists. One, I understand that some of them believe, along with the Messiah coming, that all the Jews will become Christians, and so this missionary aspect. And the other thing is now with these state laws where they're saying, that they're going to teach the Bible in school and claiming,
Right.
that they know how to, and that it's going to be neutral and stuff, when I know
won't
that the
be.
way they might look at the, 5 books of Moses or something is going to be different. And not all families, not all communities have the opportunity of Jewish day schools. I will also make it, it was actually a very uncomfortable thing. In this past week, I had a mother, we were aware that this mother was fairly religious. This time she was telling me that Mashiach is already here, and she actually used that word. And that, there was going to be all this change in the next year or two. And I was also in the position, and unfortunately it was an extended appointment where I ended up not being with anyone else present, where she point blank was asking me if I was Jewish at the end. It was a very uncomfortable situation, and I don't know what religious practice within the Christianity she has, but I hadn't heard this thing where they already think the Mashiach is here, and that's just a matter of certain thing. I know that the end of days war, some of them are thinking that's all happening now. So there's all this stuff that's looking forward to the violence because of the scriptures that exist in the Christian thing, and then this whole view. So I've always been uncomfortable with Israel having such a close relationship with the far right Christians because of some of those goals. And I don't know, I don't understand why they're comfortable with that, because I think that some of those rabbis in Israel are aware that those Christian leaders, I don't know if you know anything.
So it's fascinating that you brought that up, and it's not easy when you're in a conversation like that. There is there is a significant, small, but a significant, loud, well-funded coterie of evangelical Christians in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, who are missionaries who here know me when she was still in living in Jerusalem. She and her friends were, I won't say accosted, but the nicer version of accosted by evangelical Christian missionaries to say, we'll pay you. I don't know if you've heard about this, but many of us know about, we'll give you a stipend. We'll pay you, weekly or once a month if you just come to not a Bible study group, because they realize that's not the audience, but if you come to have dinner with us, if you come, listen, that is classic cult-like behavior, right? And I will tell you that many of our daughter's friends said, I'm not worried. They're not going to get me. They're going to give me a few dollars, and I'll be able to buy groceries in the expensive Machane Yehuda market I like to shop in. Tough. And our daughter, who is adamant and principled, said, hell no, I'm not going to take their money. It's wrong. They have an agenda. And Debbie and I are a little bit on a different place with this. She agreed with Nomi, and I said, maybe, I'm not 100% sure. Hell, take their money, for all the years of anti-Semitism and church-based hatred, we'll close our eyes, take their money, and say, thank you very much. I'm being flippant about it, but these issues come up all the time. Another classic example in early Israeli history was Ben-Gurion. He was slammed for agreeing to take German reparations money in the 40s, right? Israel was a basket case economically. Israel took in almost double its population size, about 600,000 from North Africa, from the Mizrach, from Edot Mizrach, a poor country of 600,000, half-starved. We just fought a war. We just won a war. Oh, let's double our population. We have no money. And Germany at the time offered millions and millions of dollars, Deutschmarks at that time, out of reparations. Many people in the Knesset, including Menachem Begin, including others, said Ben-Gurion is selling the Jewish soul. And I see, Ruth, that you're nodding. You probably remember those conversations. And Ben-Gurion, love him or hate him, said, yes, you're right, tough. We have to survive. We have to live. This country is right now on the edge. We will take their money. We know darn well, that is people, Menachem Begin said it's blood money. They are buying off their guilt. And Ben-Gurion said, yeah, fine. We'll use that money to grow our country into strength. Ruth, I want to put you on the spot. Do you remember those conversations?
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
What people were saying at the time, was your family or people were they supportive of Ben-Gurion? Were they saying we should stand on principle and not take it?
Not my family, but there were people who objected and didn't take anything.
Yeah.
Didn't want to take anything.
Many of them did. Jerry,
Yeah, you'll see.
Regarding that, I'm evangelist. From what I recall, those evangelists also supported Donald Trump. Am I correct? Donald Trump.
Yes. Yes.
Now,
yes.
And so they supported Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is also a big supporter of Israel, but again goes to the same agenda. He's a big supporter of Israel, but he's got his own agenda too, and I believe he's a true friend of Israel. But we have to always be suspicious. You follow me? He's dreaming about forcing Israel one day to sign peace. He wanted that a long time ago, and he's a good friend. And that comes back to the same two-state solution and what have you. And if push comes to shove, he might be forcing Israel. Netanyahu say, listen, you have to sign a paper. This is the best deal you got. So we take what we got.
Joe, Yossi, what he wants is the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
And if he can get
what
them
I'm saying
to sign peace, no, he said so. If Obama could get it, then why can't he get it? And if he can get if he can get them to sign a peace treaty, then he's hoping that he'll get the Nobel Peace Prize, and that he doesn't care about Israel. He doesn't care about anybody or anything.
Okay, we won't get political. We all love Israel, but what I'm saying is we take what we got.
Okay,
That's all.
So my issue here is somewhat similar to hearing about evangelicals kind of pressing you, about the end of days, or Ben-Gurion saying, should we take German money? The same thing with perhaps either President-elect Trump or others. He has his own skeletons in his closet, right? Dining with Holocaust deniers in Charlottesville, saying, fine people on both sides. Should that matter to us? And at the end of the day, Levy says, take the help and keep our eyes open. And I think that's the only thing that we can do, up until the time where we can't cross a certain line.
So, Jerry,
from certain people, does it feel too hypocritical? We have to make that decision each time. But if President-elect Trump, or if evangelical or somebody else is going to be supportive, at least Levy is saying, the book is called Israel Alone, right? He's saying, so that we're not completely alone, we have to make that judgment call each time, and sometimes walk away from the help. Sometime here, like our daughter said, no, I'm not going to take it. It makes me feel too unclean. But not all of us have the luxury to do that.
Yeah, so Jerry, tying what you just said in with what Terry said earlier, because I think she's right. There are some things going on in that community that thinks it's just being supportive of us. Like when they use the phrase Judeo-Christian, whatever that's supposed to be, what I think they mean is Christian, and that they don't really understand that we might read what they call the Old Testament differently than they do. So how we are strategic about that maybe is above my pay grade, but I think you have to be sort of eyes open to that fact that there are not everything is agreement. There's disagreement too, and how do we process both in a respectful way if possible? And if not, then how do you walk away without harming Israel or any other long-term concern? I don't know, but I think Terry's certainly right that we can say they have their own agenda, but sometimes their agenda is really inimical to ours. So that's the problem.
Jerry,
Yeah,
Jerry, you were gonna talk about Syria.
yes.
And this is exactly the problem the United States is now involved in. Do we support Assad, or do we support his enemies who are Al-Qaeda people?
I just want to,
So let me pause for a minute and finish a bit of this theme, and then I do want to speak somewhat about Syria and Iran. We watched the news segment the other night, and forgive me, this anchor, I won't name the person, but on her best day, she doesn't know the difference between Shia, Sunni, and a shoelace. And to hear these people on the news, speak about something they knew nothing about until her producer spoke something in her earpiece 30 seconds before, just drives me crazy. Debbie says I should turn the news off. It'll be better for me. It's so much more complicated. Somebody asked, oh, actually, Nomi, I'll throw her in again. She's doing this semester abroad in Switzerland before she finishes law school in Jerusalem. And very smart woman, I forgot from what country, also in law school, of course, in this semester program, talked to our daughter about broadly the Middle East. And she asked her, do you know what's going on there? And Nomi said, well, I'm Israeli. And she said, oh, whose side are you on? Kacha. And Nomi and we kind of laughed. Oh, it's like a football game. It's, do you like Ohio or do you like Michigan? Whose side are you on? It's just so absurd. We talked about Jewish students not having enough history. Americans bichlal, and I'm sure other societies also, are just so oversimplified. Whose side are you on? So Syria is a perfect example. Is the enemy of my enemy my friend? No, the enemy of my enemy actually could still be my enemy. And please God, I hope there are people in the State Department who know enough, the ones who are there and the ones who are coming in. Let me finish a bit of this theme though. Hold on for a sec. He writes, tragedy is Greek, not Jewish. I thought that was a great line. The major task of a Jew is not, like Oedipus, to determine that the gods are cruel and that irreconcilable forces run the world behind our backs. The major task of a Jew is to survive. And from this point of view, yes, the Jews are more alone than they've ever been. So what he's saying is that Dafka, now more than ever, but probably throughout our history, our responsibility is to survive. And that probably means maybe at times holding our nose and taking support if it's going to mean that it will help us to survive. So he speaks about many other things about how we survive. And he also says that not only are the Jews alone, it's Jews, not just Israel. And that's one of his themes. This is not about the nation state of Israel. It's about the nation state of the Jews, which happens to be Israel. And what's important to him is that this is about all Jews who are equal in the eyes of everyone else. Okay, so now let me do a little bit about what's going on in Syria, a little bit of backtracking. And obviously I know that this is a reading and a savvy consumer group. Who are the rebels in Syria? And those of you who don't know me, this is actually, in addition to being an educator, my graduate work is actually in Middle East history and foreign policy. And I love this stuff. I mean, I think it's so fascinating. And I have no internal GPS. If I travel someplace 10 different times, I have to literally consciously think, do I turn to the right or turn to the left? Debbie knows this innately. I think she swallowed a GPS when she was 2. On the other hand, every battle, every ethnic group in Syria, Operation Litani, that stuff kind of stays in my head. So who knows? So what's the impact on Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah? Let's talk a little bit about what's going on. This is in northwest Syria. I'm sorry, I don't have the map up. There are 2 major insurgent groups. There's been, and I've been staying with the news today because there's been a lot of movement literally today, just even a handful of hours ago. The main group is Hayat al-Sham. I think the news is usually abbreviating them HTS because Americans love our abbreviations. Hayat al-Sham, it's Arabic for the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant. So even that is kind of interesting to me. It used to be in the 18th century, the 19th century, early 20th century, people called it the Levant. Levantine, right, is the adjective. When people were speaking about the organization ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, President Obama insisted on calling it ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. I thought that was a very political move on his part because he didn't want to name Syria because we had just gotten out of Syria. Calling it the Levant is both accurate and almost meaningless because nobody even knows what that is. The Levant comes from a French word lever, meaning to rise, as in the sunrise. The sun rises in the east. So that's the etymology of it. Calling it the Levant just means that it's in the east. And in the east compared to what, right? The reason why we say Near East, Far East, Middle East is just in relationship to Western Europe. That's how we get these names. So it's very Eurocentric. At any rate, the Levant today is Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Hayat al-Sham, HTS, is actually, as Sheila said, the former Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. In Arabic, it's Jabhat al-Nusra. It was formerly Al-Qaeda, and they left in 2016. But it remains a Salafi jihadi organization. The Salafis are fundamentalist Muslims. One person I read a week or so ago called them Taliban light. That's interesting. I don't, Taliban light seems like a oxymoron to me. So they're fundamentalists. They don't like, say, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS in Saudi Arabia, saying women can wear Western clothes and women can drive, even though Saudi Arabia is not exactly the French Riviera. To the Salafis, the Saudis now are an example of you've gone too far. So these are fundamentalists. These are not modernists. But somebody else wrote, I thought it was really clever. They're like Muslim Amish. They're Muslims. They live in our 21st century world, but they would really want to go back in time. So HTS is Salafi. They're fundamentalists. There's tens of thousands of fighters, maybe 30,000, perhaps even 50,000. So they are not small. They're the most powerful rebel group in Syria. For years, probably 15 years at least, during the Syrian civil war, they were in control of the Idlib region in the northwest, along the border with Turkey. doing that, they were governing about 4 million people in Syria, and they were running a civilian government, kind of like what Hamas was doing in Gaza. They were designated by Turkey, and the US and the EU as a terrorist group. But it's very possible, this is where it gets really complicated, that its offensive against Assad, Bashar al-Assad, who is an enemy of the Turks, had the support of the Turks. So take a step back. What's fascinating to me is there are 3 prominent non-Arab countries in the broad Middle East. Very powerful, very influential. What are they? Israel, that's a no-brainer. That's a gimme. Iran, which is not Arab, they're Muslim, and Turkey, which is also Muslim but not Arab. So Turkey, Iran, and Israel are the 3 non-Arab super-ish powers in the Middle East. What's fascinating is that Turkey is playing a huge role. To the Turks, and this is a theme that Levy develops. I think it's one of his most interesting things. We've talked about it. He talks about the 5 empires, one of which is the Turks, because what they would like to do is reclaim the Ottoman Empire. All these empires or wannabe empires want to reclaim their past glory. So the Turks want to reclaim the Ottoman Empire, which ruled that part of the world for 400 years, right? Moscow, Putin wants to reclaim the Russian Empire, really the Soviet, but the Russian Empire. Iran wants to reclaim the Persian Empire. It's really fascinating to me. Look, there are some small, tiny, but there are some Jews, some Israelis, some Zionists who would like to reclaim, I barely call it an empire, but the Davidic kingdom, the Davidic Solomonic kingdom, both sides of the Jordan, right? So I guess we all want our past glory. We had a tiny glory compared to those other guys. So the Turks want to play it both ways. They have, and their enemy in all of this is Syria, yes, but also the Kurds. They're desperately afraid of the Kurds having enough support to become Kurdistan, which is really fascinating. So HTS, Hayat al-Sham, they would like to topple the Assad regime. They already control Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria. Damascus, Aleppo. Damascus has 2.5 million. I think Aleppo has 1.6 million. It is not a small city. It's also one of the major financial cities in the country. The second major group in the anti-Assad offensive is called the SNA, the Syrian National Army. It's a coalition of like 5 or 6 different subgroups, also backed and funded and trained by Turkey. Their goal is also to topple Assad. Their goal is also to fight the Kurds along with the Turks. There's another group called the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. These guys are backed by the US. They're led by the Kurds, and they're hostile to Assad and Turkey. So here's it's a mess, right? Here's the scenario. If HTS today, I was keeping up, like I said, with the news, they've already controlled Aleppo. It looks like they were going to control Hama, which is the 4th largest city in Syria. If HTS and its allies defeat Assad, they could replace the government with a Taliban-like government. It's recognized in Israel, it's recognized that Israel hurting Hezbollah led them to be able to do this. And here's either the irony or just how, the world is so complicated. But Israel's not getting any credit for this. What else is new? Here's a diversions. In 81, when Israel hit the Iraqi nuclear site in Osirak, Begin was still the prime minister. They got slammed by the US, by the EU, by the world, of course, by the Arab and Muslim countries. And then years later, when Saddam Hussein rises to power, and people say, wow, that guy could have been sitting on top of a nuclear arms facility. Darn good that Israel took that out. That's not what people said, but it's what they thought, right? So in this instance, what's fascinating to me is that Israel hitting Hezbollah with the pager attack and with the walkie-talkies, and Israel, Dafka, really wounding Iran by going after their SAMs, their surface-to-air missile defensive batteries, wounded them as well, and obviously decimating Hamas, if not like Netanyahu says, quote unquote, destroying them utterly. I don't know if that's even possible, but they've really decimated them, really, really hurt Hezbollah, not just by their pager attack, but also by targeted assassinations, and hurt Iran directly as well. Because of that, Hayat al-Sham said, now's our time, right? Because Syria was aided by Hezbollah, by Iran, also by Russia, who's tied down in Ukraine, right? So because Russia's weaker, Iran's weaker, Hezbollah is really weaker, now they said, okay, here's our moment. And people, I get a kick out of it when those anchors who really don't know what they're talking about say, oh, no one could have expected this. As soon as Israel did what they did, most analysts should have been able to say, oh man, stand back because look what's happening here. So that's one issue, that HTS and its allies defeat Assad. They replace the government with their own government. They won't necessarily, send a parade to Israel, but in their heart of hearts, they know why that happened. Again, though, I'll say that they're not a friend of Israel. HTS's chief cleric, I had to look him up, Abdul Atun, said after the killing of Sinwar, we ask the Lord to disgrace the Jews, oppress them, and curse them and those who support them. So they're not our buddies, right? But most experts say their anti-Israel rhetoric won't go beyond rhetoric. It's not in their interest to take Israel on. The concern, though, amongst most analysts, I was reading a lot today when I was supposed to do my day job, is that people are really concerned with the chemical weapons that might fall into these guys' hands. If you remember, Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, who was a real SOB, killed either 30, 40, maybe even 50,000 of his own countrymen in a poison gas attack in '82. Terrible, awful, ugly. Syria still has storehouses of chemical weapons. The danger is that even though these guys are going to have their hands full controlling Syria, Israeli analysts in some of the states are saying they will probably not take on Israel, but you never know, once the dominoes start falling, somebody else could seize power among this group and possibly, probably even get their hands on some terrible, terrible chemical weapons. So that's the problem. The other issue is that HTS might eventually confront Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon. That could be a good thing, because even though Hezbollah has been weakened, they still exist, and they still have thousands and thousands of rockets, and they still have the infrastructure. So these guys are enemies of Hezbollah. If they come to power in Syria and consolidate their power, if they pushed back against the Kurds who are against them, if they sign an agreement or just an alliance with Turkey, they might start looking around and saying, okay, now where do we go? There is Hezbollah, not just in Lebanon, but in Syria also. So they might be able to smash Hezbollah in Syria. And then unfortunately, people in power start looking around for more power. So that, to me, that's the danger. Right now, it's probably not in their best interest to take on Israel. But ego is a funny thing. Debbie's the therapist, I'm not. But the reason why I think geopolitics is so fascinating to me is that, in a way, countries act like people do, because countries are ruled by people with egos, with insecurity, with reasons to prove themselves to their father. For all I know, I'm not a Freudian, is that everything Bashar al-Assad is doing is to gain the love of his dead father. Who knows? And to do that, he might in the end take on Israel. So let me pause, because that's
wait a minute,
a
Syria?
crazy amount. Any questions?
You're saying that Assad would take on Israel?
No. I'm saying that HTS, Hayat al-Sham, if they defeat Assad, might, once they consolidate their power, take on Israel. Most people think no. Their rhetoric, actually, I read a few things today. They're almost trying to soften their rhetoric, except for what
Yeah.
I read from the cleric, saying no. Our goal is not to export our revolution, like Iran talks about, like ISIS talked about. Our goal is to consolidate our power in Syria itself. We're here for the Syrian people, and the Syrian people are here for us. That sounds very nice. Let's just say I don't necessarily trust that that's as far as they'll go. But right now, the concern after they consolidate powers, maybe they look around and say, who's next? The very next people who are next are Hezbollah. After that, they might start looking at Israel.
Well, I think HDS, according to, I think it was JTA, said that he knows he's going to have to soften his view. They are very traditional Muslims. They're fanatics, but he knows that he's going to have to soften his view if he wants to be successful in Syria.
Yeah, and successful to gain backing and support even by Turkey, much less the West. Oh, this is also very interesting. Syria is because of Hafez al-Assad, his dad, and Bashar al-Assad, is its infrastructure and its tactical policy is all Soviet. It's not even Russian, it's Soviet, meaning that a lot of their stuff is falling apart, meaning that it's very, very centralized and top heavy. One of the reasons why the Israeli military has been so successful is that it's decentralized, and young officers are given the encouragement to make decisions in the field. It's very different than old-fashioned armies. The army in this country is closer to that. The Soviets is the other end of the spectrum. So the Syrian army is both tactically and technologically Soviet. HTS, HTS is Western, because they've gotten most of their weaponry and most of their tactics from Turkey, which, by the way, is in the Middle East, but it's a NATO ally, right? So they're structurally and technologically very different. It's one of the reasons why the Syrians have done so badly. What's interesting about Aleppo, just yesterday, 2 days ago already, it's gone so fast, is I laughed out loud when I read that the Syrian military said, we have chosen to redeploy, another word for get the hell out of there, because we were concerned about the safety of the civilians. Give me a break. Their army has never been concerned about the safety of the Syrian civilians.
That's the whole problem there.
Yeah. So that's, any other questions about that? There's a little bit more about
Jerry, I just have one, because I don't understand Syria all that well, but what little I do seem to know is that there are a number of different ethnic or religious groups within the country. So I'm wondering if whether or not Assad stays in power, how easy it is for, obviously Assad has a problem with controlling all those groups. So too might the Salafi group.
So yes, one of the reasons why Assad was never in either his dad or Bashar al-Assad has been loved well, first they're awful people, but they're also Alawis. In English, most people say Alawite, which is a heterodox offshoot of Islam. So they're not trusted by the rank and file Muslim in Syria because they're kind of weird in their concept of Islam. And so much, we think that we're divided, between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. No, these guys barely, Lahavdil, but it's like the Mithnagdim and the Hasidim in 18th century Poland, where they very famously, very infamously, literally didn't eat in each other's homes because they didn't trust each other's kashrut. We've kind of gotten beyond that, not so much, but at least we don't shoot each other anymore. These guys in Syria, no, they're at loggerheads, kind of like very grossly Sunni and Shia Muslims. That's why you got that phenomenon where ISIS was beheading not just Jews and Christians, but fellow Muslims because they thought that they were apostates. So David's right. In Syria, it's a patchwork of probably a dozen, probably 15 at the least, major factions. Some of them here, like in Iraq, Saddam Hussein was known as a Tikriti because he was from Tikrit, the town. That's where his clan was, and he made sure that his cabinet, his administration, was full of Tikritis. The Assads made sure that their cabinet and their inner circle was full of Alawis, Alawites. So, and here, Lebanon is another example. The Lebanese constitution is mishugal legamre, just completely crazy. The president has to be Sunni, the prime minister has to be Shia, and the speaker of the parliament has to be Druze. So seriously, that's a country? That's craziness. So you're right. If this group, Hayat al-Sham, does come to power, their ability to control this patchwork quilt is going to be slightly better, but not so much better than Assad himself. The reason how Assad was able to rule was like Tito in Yugoslavia with an iron fist. When Tito was off the grid, that's why Yugoslavia fell apart into Croatia and Serbia and Herzegovina and right. So the same thing with Syria. Nothing holds them together. Barely anything holds Lebanon together as well. So let me pause there.
Jerry,
They're all
Jerry,
very small.
Yes, also small. Although Hayat al-Sham controls about 30% of the country right now. So it's not insignificant, but it's only a third, less than a third. Yeah, Yossi.
I just want to throw something. Talking to some people from Syria that I know, some people that know, they say Assad was, as we know, he was like Tito. He was a dictator. He was a strong guy.
Yeah.
Then when he was coming to an end, he chose his son Bashar, who was really educated to be an obstetrician. He was a doctor, eye doctor. He is not into politics, but he was put into place.
Right.
So Assad nominated his generals. They are running the country. The big generals. They are running the country behind him. He's just a figurehead.
So I think
That's what I
that's
heard.
right. But he also has gained over the years. Nobody thought that he would last this long since he attained power. But I think he's learned, at his father's feet and through the generals to be just as ruthless. I mean, these are really, really bad guys. And at the same time, the rebel group in Syria has also been castigated for executions, for their treatment of women, for their treatment of Jews there anymore, treatment of Christians. So nobody is there because they're good people and they're believers of democracy.
By the way, most of the Jews were living in Aleppo, which used to be called Halep.
Right.
Halep.
Right,
And
right.
most of them Syrian Jews emigrated to France and other places, and they're very successful business-wise. We
Right,
used to
there's a
call them
lot of
Halep Jews.
Yeah, there's a lot of Syrian Jews in upstate New York.
Yeah.
We know some of them
Halep.
having lived in Cleveland.
In New Deal, New Jersey has it. what's his name was
Yeah.
Syrian,
Yedid.
Yedid.
Yeah, right. So here, Syria's in control of the Syrian government under Assad is in control of the smallest amount of territory they've controlled since 71. There is corruption. There is a serious problem with morale in the government and the army. Its traditional allies, Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia, are tied down with their own issues, and Israel, ironically, is in ascendance. Here's some more irony that Hamas, when they attacked Israel on October 7th, they thought not only was it going to be a horrific attack, it was going to be the start of a more globalized war against Israel, right? They attacked brutally, savagely, and they assumed that Hezbollah, their natural ally, would come crashing through the Golan. They actually hesitated, thank goodness. And every time that Israel, counteroffensive became even stronger and stronger, Hezbollah shot some missiles. The Houthis got into it, but it wasn't what Hamas thought. Now, Dafka, Hamas is decimated, Hezbollah is weakened, Iran is weakened. So interestingly, ironically, what Hamas did, terrible, awful, killed, now thousands, soldiers, everything, but ironically set off a chain of events that in the weirdest way has made Israel stronger. It's really that this stuff will be studied for decades about, the law of unintended consequences, that these targeted and look, and Israel's catching flack from everywhere, right? What they've done, what they're still doing in Gaza, even in Hezbollah, in Lebanon against Hezbollah. But at the end of the day, at least militarily, physically, they're stronger. Okay. Just a few more minutes. So that's kind of where we are. Iran is in a weak. Oh, and of course the other thing geopolitically. So Iran is weaker, Hezbollah is weaker, Hamas is almost off the board, Syria is almost weaker, and of course, January 20th, we have a new administration in this country. So a lot of people geopolitically in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in China, and of course in the Middle East are wondering how that's going to impact things. Will the Trump administration, quote unquote, give a green light to Israel even more? Will, as Sheila said, President-elect Trump, I agree with you from everything everyone reads, is so focused on, obsessed by the concept of a Nobel that he'll do anything to win that. Will he want to, quote, make a deal, which he's famous for saying he can do? So yes, supportive of Israel, but he's so transactional. I think even his supporters say that as well, that, we can't bank on the new administration being necessarily supportive unless he thinks it'll bode well for him.
Well, I think Saudi Arabia, there'll be peace with Saudi Arabia. I think that
and that's
he will be
interesting
able
too.
to achieve.
Right, because if the Saudis are reading the board game as we're all reading it, they'll also maybe say now's the time for them because their ancient enemy is Iran, right? Politically, religiously, nationalistically, and financially. For all those reasons, it's Iran and the Saudis for decades. And politics is kind of a zero-sum game. If somebody descends, somebody ascends. If somebody gets stronger, the other gets weaker. So they're looking at this saying, just like the Syrian rebels, now was their time. They're not going to, quote, attack Iran, I doubt, but they may want to make their move toward the West, toward Israel and toward the U.S. When President Trump gets in. So it's really fascinating. What we'll do in the next is to talk about Levy's definition of Zionism. why Israel is alone, and I'll leave you with this teaser. I think I've even mentioned this before. A science teacher who had been at the Mandel School for 7 years, 8 years, lovely woman, happened not to be Jewish, wasn't that religious herself. Her mom was a church-going Christian woman, loved when Nancy, her name, Nancy took our 8th graders to Israel a couple of times. Very, very tall, not just among, shorter Jews, but very tall young woman. So she could stand out at the Kotel in the plaza and wave. Everybody could see her when we had the camera on her. Her mother asked her, sweetheart, let me know when you're in Jerusalem at the Western Wall. And her church group was hanging out, even with the time difference, to watch Nancy and our 8th graders on the Kotel cam in Jerusalem. It was very sweet. Her mom cried. Her friends at the church cried. So Nancy, lovely, lovely, brilliant science teacher, had been to Israel a couple of times with the school, learned a lot, learned about our holidays and kashrut and Israel. And she came to me, I may have mentioned a couple of you, she came to me one time after the 8th graders had a program about anti-Semitism, literally in tears. She said, Jerry, you got to explain this to me. Well, please don't take offense. Why do people hate you guys? It makes no sense to me. Very smart woman, well-read, inquisitive, curious. She said, I don't get it. I've learned a lot of history working at this school. Greeks, Romans, Babylonians. I think she got the order wrong. I won't hold it against her. But I don't understand it. Why are so many people over so many years, hateful? So I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to do that the next session. Thanks, everybody.